Hello, strangers. But it's funny, because you look kind of familiar. It makes sense. We've been meeting up this way for a year now. Happy year-iversary, everybody. And to celebrate, here's story number 108. For context of the story, I'm a guy and I went to boot in the late 2010s. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The physical training was bad enough, but the way they have it set up, you're sleep deprived nearly the whole time. Your body just starts feeling like you're not really attached to it anymore, reacting to shouts and prompts without you choosing to, like a puppet on strings. Once I got through it, though, came my MOS school out in Virginia, and that was hard for a completely different reason. See, we still rocked around and all, but now we had time to sleep and weren't being screamed at for existing. But the training, that was hard as hell. A mental hike loaded down with IT equipment and acronyms. It was a different kind of exhausting. I no longer felt like I was detached from my body. Quite the opposite. I felt like I was locked into a body that had to sit still, sit in classes, sit and study. It drove us all a little crazy with cabin fever. It didn't help, of course, that when you first get out of boot, you're not released back into the real world, not even at your training school. See, boot breaks you down so you can be built back up into a nice, uniform shape and attitude. But resetting something like that takes time, and outside influences could mess up all their work in molding you into grunt_01. Can't have that. So somebody way up in the leadership ranks set it up so that for the first few months after boot, you're restricted as to if and when and for how long you can be out of their sight. They sort of drip feed the real world back slowly, not giving you privileges to leave base for a while, mandating field days. Don't get it twisted, a field day is an all-hands-on-deck deep cleaning of the barracks. Nothing in the field at all. Stuff like that. They say it promotes safety, stops us from going out into the public, getting rowdy, or having our newly tuned reflexes snapping at some perceived provocation, or spending our paltry paychecks signing ourselves up for some crazy car loan. Apparently, we're only allowed to sign our souls over into servitude one contract at a time, and the military wants its fair share first. But some of those 20% plus interest rates are pretty scary. But this is all deeply ironic. The scariest, pants-loadingest thing that has ever happened to me so far happened on a night when my group was stuck on base, in the very barracks we'd just deep cleaned. It was a lot of us left milling around after the inspection, eyes still stinging from how much simple green and pine sol had been spilled. Some of the guys who'd come in before us had departed, having the base privileges to do so. Others did what young, enterprising E1s and E2s will do, and somehow had come into possession of a few bottles of hard liquor. Nothing fancy. No single malt whiskeys, we didn't have the pay for that. But the stuff was high octane, and screw top or not, a glass of that looks pretty refreshing after the hours of frantic activity we'd just done. A group of young bucks, all in PT gear, t-shirts and shorts or sweats, tired, mentally drained from training, and now a little loosened up with a shot or two in us. The sun had gone down, and the only light outside was that cheesy yellow light from the streetlights, surrounded with halos of gnats that made it look misty, shifty in the dark. The barracks floors were linoleum tile, and a lot of us sat on them near our open doors like a low-rent block party. There were probably about 8 or 9 of us that hadn't left for the bars or gone to bed, closing our doors, and someone there got the idea that we should play a game. What game? Well, the guy, DeLuca, had from places unknown acquired a board game. We all groaned, thinking it'd be something like Risk, something you'd have to think about, or something lame like Handyland. But no, the board he pulled out only had one playing piece, a planchette. It was a Ouija board. I'd never touched one. My parents were deeply religious Baptists. Getting caught with stuff like that in their house? Shoot, I'd rather be caught with a joint or sneaking a girl into my room. But that liquor was amplifying a sort of F-it feeling in me I'd been growing since my first day at boot camp. I wasn't Mama's little Tommy anymore. I was grown. I'd flown the nest. I was out here doing some serious growth into the adult world. And silly little superstitions about a mass-manufactured board game, pressed cardboard and a plastic pointer, that was little kid stuff. And it wasn't like DeLuca was some flagrant devil worshipper. He'd said his people were Presbyterians. I'm pretty sure that's like, same as Baptist, but they can dance at parties. I saw him as sort of a PG-13 to my PG background, which was the right amount of risk escalation to my mind. So I rogered up, said sure, I'd play. 4 of us did. It was DeLuca, me, Johnson, and Voorhees. We spread that sucker out right there in the hallway and began to have a go. If you haven't played with a Ouija board before, it goes like this. It's a flat rectangle with the words hello, goodbye, yes, and no. And the alphabet. That's on there too, with like suns and moons and stuff. I don't know, I'm sure there's symbolism, but my background meant I didn't know it, except I really didn't like that sun. Its smile seemed kinda smug. How you play. You start by having all the players put their fingertips on the planchette, this flat, plastic, arrow-shaped thing with a little clear circle in the middle. All the players push the planchette across the board to the hello, which I guess is like how you tell the board, and any spirits listening, that you've picked up the phone and want to talk. Then the leader asks a question, and the planchette, supposedly controlled by whoever picked up on the other end, moves to an answer. All the players have to keep their hands on the planchette or it doesn't work. Breaks the connection, DeLuca said. He went over all these rules, and those were the bigs. There were more. Obviously, asking yes or no questions is quickest because it's one move to a yes or no. But we were drunk, so I can't say I remember all of them. We put our fingertips on the pointer and pushed it to hello. Then DeLuca said aloud, "Is anyone listening?" Silence. Under my hand, I felt the planchette twitch. And from somewhere down the hallway, one of the guys yelled, "Unfortunately." Understandable. We picked up the board and moved to the day room, out of the hallway that echoed every sound, every rubber shower sandal squeak. We were laughing, cutting up, but that light mood died when we hit the day room. Day room was a communal room with a couple of sagging couches and a decrepit CRT television from the 90s. See, the hallway had the best lighting. Most of the lights throughout the rest of the barracks flickered, and the day room was one of the worst. Something about sitting around that spooky board in a guttering light, and all those childhood guilty feelings I had about touching something forbidden. Well, it started to send a little unease through me. Not that I was going to let any of the guys know about that, though. So I put my fingers back on the board, and rushing before I could chicken out, I looked at DeLuca, who asked the next question. "Are you a person, or something else. When I tell you that planchette launched, I mean it. It just yeeted across the board in the direction of the hello. It was so forceful I knew it had to be Voorhees just messing with me. Snapped my face up from the board to yell at him, even as DeLuca was yelling at me, and Johnson at DeLuca, all of us confident that it had been the other that had thrown it. My words died on my tongue. Voorhees, the one I'd yelled at, was looking at me, wide-eyed and angry too. None of us had shoved it. All of us were pissed at the other for shoving it. I let myself feel that dread seep in for a moment before I shut it down. Good actors, I told myself. Like I said, I felt the thing jerk out of my hand. One of these guys was just messing with me to be an a-hole. I told DeLuca my bad, and we resumed our positions as Johnson retrieved the planchette from the corner of the room by the window where it had landed. Dayroom light was bad that night. The only constant light we had was that yellowy glow from the streetlight outside. My friends' faces looked shadowy, and as we settled our hands back in place, everyone looked really serious. DeLuca asked again if anyone was listening. The planchette twitched, and much slower this time, it dragged over to the yes. DeLuca's mouth opened to ask another question, but the planchette nudged back to the letters. We watched as it began to spell out something more. W, E, H, A, V, E, B, E, E, N. We have been. Shit, Johnson breathed out. He settled backwards like he wanted to put distance between himself and the board. Voorhees looked at DeLuca and asked him what that meant. DeLuca had always acted real confident, both in boot and in class. I'd taken him for a sort of arrogant kid who'd had life come easy to him, but as I watched his face in that dim light, I saw for the first time a look of uncertainty. And that looked real, true to him, the him he maybe always was, just under the front he put on for appearances. He said it just meant that more than one person was on the other end, which wasn't unusual. I mean, more unusual than 4 privates talking to ghosts with a jumped-up Monopoly board, I guess. He said the way to dial it in to one person was to ask them to introduce themselves, and resuming speaking to the board, he asked the name of who we were talking to. The planchette twitched, then dragged over the letters S-M-I-T-H. Smith. It was a normal name, a last name. Well, we were in some pretty old barracks. I should have been comforted, felt a kinship with Smith. But it being someone who could have been like me made it feel even more eerie. I'd been picturing, literally, Statler and Waldorf as the Morleys from Muppet Christmas Carol. Blue, floaty, detached, and kinda goofy. Thinking about having a 5th ghostly private in here, his see-through hand moving the pointer, his arm stuck between us from the shadows behind us, that sobered me right up. DeLuca was asking the next question, sort of a test. He asked Smith if he could tell us something like a middle name of one of us to prove he had that ghostly insight. And the planchette moved obligingly, spelling out, Jacob, my middle name. I felt my hands go cold and removed them one by one to subtly wipe the sweat. Not subtle enough, the guys noticed and were buttheads about it, joshing me about, "Ooh, look at Peterson, he's scared."
And F it, I was. None of those guys knew anything about me. I was about to use that as an excuse to quit, say hell with it, accuse them of peeping one of the stack of paperwork we all had to carry around. But I didn't get a chance. The planchette was moving again the second I put both my hands back on it. Smith had more to say. My stomach was feeling cold and sweaty like my hands as I watched the pointer spell out his grandpa's name. Okay, no, I felt panic rise. There was no way any of these a-holes knew my grandpa's name, because I barely knew it. Grandpa Jake had passed before I'd had a chance to meet him. Even worse, he'd passed the day I'd been born. I'd been told all about it, and without going into detail, it wasn't a peaceful passing, not at all. He'd been in pain to the last, a pain that months of building up a resistance to the soothing effects of morphine hadn't been able to touch. All of that flashed to my mind the second the planchette landed on that final letter E. The chuckling stopped. I was somewhere between livid at my personal life being told and terrified as to how this was happening at all. I looked at the faces around me. DeLuca, Johnson, they too looked properly scared. But Voorhees, he looked, uh-oh. You know that look someone gets when there's a dare on the table? That machismo, hold my beer look when someone's decided to just jump? That's the look that was on Voorhees' face. And before DeLuca could stop him with another of the rules, the rule about only one of us being the speaker, Voorhees spoke, asking a question we'd been warned not to ask. Enough boring stuff. How will I die? DeLuca and I started yelling at him, telling him to knock it off. Johnson and DeLuca had set back on their heels and their hands had lost contact. My hands and Voorhees' hands were still on the planchette, and at once, I felt it pulse. Not twitch. Pulse. Beat like a heart against my fingertips. And before I could react, snatch my hands away, it was racing through the letters. S. C. R. It's telling you to scram. See, you're such an ass you piss off dead people. Johnson was trying to interject, but that damn plastic pointer wasn't done. E. A. M. I. N. G. Screaming. Voorhees had gotten his answer. He was going to die screaming, and watching in mute horror, the planchette moved again. L. I. K. E. J. A. K. E. Grandpa Jake. I'd been told he'd died screaming, too. I ripped my hands away in shock, because I could hear it. A scream I couldn't have heard, but I was remembering, but I couldn't remember. I hadn't yet drawn breath to have been able to hear it. But no, it wasn't a memory. Someone was screaming. It was Voorhees. That look of dumb bravado was gone, and he was wide-eyed, looking down at the board, at the letters taunting him, cursing him, and he was screaming out in shock, in fear. DeLuca pushed him back and started shaking him, telling him to shut up even as the voices of people down the hallway joined in, telling us to be quiet. Little girls playing slumber party games, all of that. Johnson grabbed the planchette and plunked it down on the goodbye, then shoved the thing away from our circle up against the wall. The planchette clattered, landing finally on the letter K. We stayed up for hours talking over it, shooting looks at the board like it was going to start moving. It didn't. And by, sleep took us. We talked some the next day too, but that board disappeared. DeLuca took it somewhere, and I half suspect it was to throw it away. And we didn't mess around with that stuff again. Days passed, and the distance between us and that night grew. It made us forget the fear. We passed our school, and one by one, we got orders to our duty stations. Kept in touch with social media, and I still talked to Johnson regularly as we ended up at the same base. And things are normal. There's no floating candles or whispers in the night from Private Smith. But I can't shake it, not entirely. Because every so often, especially around Halloween, it'll come back to me. I'll see an advertisement for what else? The Ouija board movie. Or I'll see an ad on social media for blankets with a Ouija board printed on them. And in those moments, I'll hear it. I'll hear the scream. And I'll wonder at what point will I log into social media and see that Voorhees is passed on. Smith didn't say when it would happen, but he did give us a pretty awful hint as to the circumstances. It won't be a peaceful death. It will be screaming.
I've said it before. I think on the story about the fairy ring. There's certainly room in this life for wonder and healthy curiosity. But there's also a healthy amount of fuck around and find out. And with things like this, oof, count me out. If you'd like to reach out, email and socials are in the description. Interacting with the like, comment, and subscribe features does something, allegedly. And otherwise, we'll meet again next Tuesday. Stay strange, stay safe, and take care, strangers.